So, if you were watching the global news around April 8th, you definitely saw this massive historic event unfold. The United States and Iran signed a ceasefire.
Right. And I mean, the whole world was essentially giving a standing ovation to Pakistan. They were universally credited with brokering the deal, stepping up as this heroic, neutral mediator.
Exactly. But, what if I told you the actual author of that peace treaty, like the architect who drafted the blueprints, was sitting 3,000 miles away in Beijing?
Yeah, it completely changes the entire complexion of the event. I mean, suddenly a story about regional peacemaking becomes this masterclass in superpower shadow diplomacy.
Oh, 100%. Because the cameras capture the final handshake, but the actual geopolitical heavy lifting is happening completely out of frame.
Which is fascinating, right? It's the invisible machinery of global politics.
And that invisible machinery is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We've got a fascinating stack of sources to pull from, starting with a Patreon post that highlights this really deep dive analysis by Comma Press.
Yeah, and to corroborate that and really flesh out the mechanics, we're also cross-referencing intelligence and reporting from Xinhua, Bloomberg, The Washington Post, CNN, and Reuters via Iran International.
Right. And the real value of this specific collection of sources is that it lets us bypass the official press releases.
Exactly. We get to look at the raw data, the timelines, the leaked diplomatic cables, the intelligence reports. We can essentially reconstruct how a modern peace deal is actually manufactured when the public isn't looking.
I mean, reading through this, it feels incredibly similar to finding out that a massively successful best-selling celebrity memoir was actually penned from start to finish by a ghostwriter.
Oh, that's a perfect way to describe it.
Right, because the celebrity gets to go on the book tour and smile for the cameras, but the ghostwriter is the one who completely controls the narrative. So to figure out who our ghostwriter is in this scenario, we have to look at the manuscript itself.
Which means we need to look past the April 8th announcement and rewind the clock a little over a week. The Comma Press analysis does this brilliant side-by-side timeline comparison that is just, well, it's impossible to ignore once you see it.
Yeah, we have to go back to March 31st, to a specific meeting in Beijing.
Right, March 31st. You have Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Pakistani counterpart, Ishaq Dar, holding a press conference. And they announce what they call a 5-point joint initiative.
And the specific text of this initiative is crucial for you to understand, because it called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, a swift commencement of peace negotiations, the protection of civilian infrastructure, free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, and finally, a comprehensive peace framework operating under the UN Charter.
And, those aren't just vague diplomatic pleasantries. That is a highly specific structural framework for de-escalation.
Right. It's a blueprint.
Exactly. So then you fast forward just over a week to the official U.S.-Iran ceasefire announced on April 8th. When you put the text of the actual ceasefire right next to that Chinese-Pakistani initiative from March 31st, the structural DNA is identical.
I mean, it is practically a carbon copy. The official April 8th deal relies on this very distinct two-phase structure, which combines an initial truce with a pathway to broader negotiations. And that is exactly what Beijing outlined.
Yep. But the biggest fingerprint left on the document is the heavy, almost overriding emphasis on the temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz, that's the real tell here.
It absolutely is. It reveals the underlying motive behind the entire operation. Because to understand why Beijing would quietly architect a ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, we have to look at the Bloomberg report in our stack.
The one that zeroes in on geography and economics.
Exactly. Restoring normal navigation through the Strait of Hormuz isn't some altruistic side benefit for Beijing. It is a massive existential priority.
Because that strait is arguably the most critical energy bottleneck on the planet, right? I mean, something like 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that one narrow strip of water.
Yeah, and China is the manufacturing engine of the world. That engine requires an unimaginable, uninterrupted flow of fuel. A massive percentage of China's energy imports travel right through that specific waterway.
Oh, wow. So if a conflict between the U.S. and Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, ships don't move.
Ships don't move. And if ships don't move, Chinese factories power down, supply chains freeze, and the economic fallout for Beijing is instantaneous and catastrophic.
So brokering this deal literally has nothing to do with wanting to win a Nobel Peace Prize. It is a highly aggressive move to protect their own vital supply lines.
Exactly. It's all about keeping their economic engine running.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, though, because that logic creates a pretty massive contradiction. If China needs this waterway open so desperately, and they literally drafted the 5-point blueprint that stopped the fighting, why on earth wouldn't they want the global PR of taking credit for it?
It's a great question.
Right, because stepping between the US and Iran to broker peace proves you are the dominant global superpower. Giving that massive trophy to Pakistan just seems entirely counterintuitive.
Well, it does seem counterintuitive until you look at the legal and diplomatic liabilities of actually signing your name to a peace treaty. This is where the distinction between a mediator and a diplomatic intermediary becomes incredibly important.
Okay, so Pakistan wasn't really a mediator.
Not in the traditional sense, no. They weren't negotiating terms between two hostile parties.
Yeah.
According to the mechanics detailed in our sources, Pakistan functioned as a publicly acceptable front.
And the mechanics of how they achieved that are honestly mind-blowing. There is this crazy detail from the Reuters report, citing a diplomat involved in the process, that just completely changes how you view international negotiations.
Oh, the electronic part.
Yes. They didn't describe Pakistan as a partner sitting at a big oak table. They explicitly noted that the ceasefire memorandum was, quote, finalized electronically through Pakistan.
Yeah. Think about the implications of that phrase, finalized electronically. Pakistan was operating less like a diplomatic delegation and more like a highly secure diplomatic VPN.
A geopolitical virtual private network. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
If you want to access a sensitive network without anyone tracing your IP address, you use a VPN.
Exactly. Washington and Beijing cannot be seen openly collaborating on Middle Eastern security architecture right now. The domestic and international optics are just too complex.
So they route their data, their negotiations, and their terms through Islamabad. Pakistan masks the origin of the deal.
Right. And beyond just masking the collaboration, it actively shields Beijing from liability. The Washington Post reporting from last week corroborates this beautifully.
They noted that behind closed doors, Beijing applied immense pressure on Iran to accept the deal.
Yes. But, and this is key, China deliberately and explicitly stopped short of committing to act as a formal guarantor of the ceasefire.
Which means what, practically? Like, if you are a formal guarantor of a peace treaty, what kind of homework does that actually assign you?
Basically, being a guarantor in international diplomacy means you are co-signing the mortgage. You are taking on the legal and diplomatic responsibility to enforce the terms. So if China publicly puts its name on that document as the guarantor, and 3 days later a rogue militia fires a missile or a drone strikes an oil tanker, China is now legally obligated to step in and fix it.
Wow. They'd have to sanction Iran or deploy naval assets or publicly condemn one of the parties?
Exactly. They would be forced to police a volatile region, which is the exact opposite of what they want.
They just want the oil to flow. They don't want the geopolitical babysitting job that comes with it.
Exactly right.
It honestly reminds me of a multinational corporation building a massive new skyscraper. The corporation designs the building, they fund it, and they are going to own it when it's done. But they hire a smaller subcontractor to do all the highly dangerous, risky physical labor.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If a beam falls or a deadline is missed, the subcontractor takes all the public heat and the legal liability. Pakistan is the subcontractor taking the risk, but China gets the open shipping lanes.
The subcontractor analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. China gets to exert massive, invisible leverage over Tehran's decision-making without painting a target on its own back.
But, looking at this purely as a strategic maneuver, stripping away all the domestic politics and moral judgments for a second, our ghostwriter is playing a very dangerous double game here.
Yeah, they really are.
Because the intelligence reporting from CNN that just surfaced adds a whole new layer to this that is genuinely jarring.
The CNN report completely shatters the idea that this is just a straightforward stabilization effort.
Right, because according to U.S. intelligence, while China is quietly orchestrating this delicate electronic ceasefire to calm the region, Beijing is simultaneously preparing to deliver advanced air defense systems to Iran.
Yes.
And real quick, before we dive into this paradox, I just want to remind you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints or injecting domestic politics left-wing or right-wing into this.
Right, absolutely. We are strictly reporting the complex geopolitical chessboard exactly as it's outlined in the provided intelligence and source material. Impartiality is key here.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting, but also super confusing. If China's whole overriding goal is to keep the region quiet so their oil ships can pass safely, delivering heavy military hardware to one side of the conflict seems completely irrational.
It does seem completely counterproductive.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't arming one side jeopardize the very peace they just spent weeks engineering? It feels like they are throwing a match into the very room they just spent weeks fireproofing.
It really looks like a glaring paradox on the surface. Brokering peace on Monday and prepping weapons shipments on Tuesday. But in the realm of great power competition, this isn't a contradiction at all. It is the ruthless application of leverage.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, providing advanced air defense systems to Tehran achieves several incredibly strategic goals for Beijing that a simple ceasefire just cannot.
But how does an air defense system achieve a strategic goal beyond just, shooting things down?
By creating deep, long-term technological and economic tethering. Selling an advanced air defense network isn't like dropping off a shipment of rifles and walking away. It is a decades-long marriage.
Oh, because of the infrastructure required.
Exactly. It requires integrating radar networks, establishing ongoing maintenance contracts, providing constant software updates, and sending Chinese military trainers to work directly with Iranian forces.
So they aren't just selling a weapon. They are installing a permanent Chinese operating system into Iran's military infrastructure.
Perfectly said. It binds Tehran to Beijing in a way that makes Iran highly dependent on Chinese goodwill. If you control the technology that protects a nation's airspace, you inherently hold immense sway over that nation's broader strategic decisions. China built the peace, and now they are cementing their influence by controlling the locks on the doors.
Wow. That makes the leverage basically permanent. But the CNN report also touches on a more immediate tactical reason for this arms deal, and it revolves around the calendar. Because this move aggressively complicates the diplomatic landscape ahead of former President Trump's planned visit to Beijing next month.
Right. This is a classic example of what diplomats call issue linkage. In high-stakes bilateral negotiations, you never want to sit down at the table unless you have something the other side desperately wants or needs. The United States has intense security interests in the Middle East. By positioning themselves as both the invisible architect of the U.S.-Iran peace and the incoming supplier of Iran's defense systems, Beijing is holding all the most important cards.
They are essentially walking into that meeting with Trump next month, telling Washington, we control the dial in the Middle East. We can turn the temperature down with a 5-point ceasefire, or we can crank it right back up with advanced air defenses.
Exactly, which gives China an extraordinary amount of bargaining power on issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the Middle East.
Like what?
Well, they can leverage their control over Iran to extract concessions from the U.S. on tariffs, on semiconductor export controls, on trade policies. They are using their influence in the Strait of Hormuz as a geopolitical bargaining chip for a completely different negotiation in Beijing.
The scale of that strategy is just staggering.
Yeah.
But the flaw in building a structure this complex, relying on electronic back channels, third-party fronts, and paradoxical arms deals, is that the foundation is incredibly brittle.
Very brittle.
And if we look at the reality on the ground right now, this week, that foundation is actively cracking.
Yeah, the transition from a digital blueprint to actual face-to-face diplomacy is where these deals usually face their most severe stress tests.
And it failed the stress test completely. We have to look at the talks that happened just this past Sunday in Islamabad. This was supposed to be the moment where the electronic memos turned into concrete action. Both sides sent representatives to Pakistan to physically hash out the implementation of the April 8th agreement.
Right.
And the talks completely collapsed. No agreement, no progress, just immediate public finger-pointing.
And the specific language used in that public finger-pointing is so telling. It reveals the fundamental mismatch in how the two sides are approaching this.
It really does. Look at the divergence in the official statements. And again, neutrally speaking, you have Vice President J.D. Vance asserting very plainly that the talks failed because Iran, quote, chose not to accept our terms.
Right. It's a statement entirely focused on the mechanics of the deal. The parameters, the conditions, the transactional nature of the agreement.
Exactly. But then you contrast that with the statement from the Speaker of Iran's parliament. He didn't mention the terms at all. He stated that the talks collapsed because Washington failed to gain Tehran's trust.
Trust versus terms. It is the classic impasse in international relations. One side views the ceasefire as a binding legal contract where specific boxes need to be checked. The other side views it as a test of underlying intentions.
Right.
If you are arguing about a legal parameter, you can usually find a compromise. But if the baseline of trust doesn't exist, especially when both sides know the original blueprint was ghost-written by a superpower with its own hidden agenda. The whole thing unravels.
Which brings us to Monday morning. The public talks in Islamabad fall apart on Sunday. The entire fragile architecture of this ceasefire is teetering on the edge, and immediately the invisible architect has to step right back out of the shadows to catch it.
They cannot afford for that building to collapse. The stakes for their domestic economy are simply too high.
Right. We have a dispatch from Xinhua detailing that on Monday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is urgently back on the phone with Pakistan's Ishaq Dar. These are the exact same two men who stood in Beijing on March 31st and presented the original 5-point initiative.
Yep.
They are back on the line, trying to patch the holes in the server.
And the diplomatic language Xinhua chose to publish is highly irregular. Wang Yi isn't using standard measured diplomatic phrasing here.
No, not at all.
He is urging Pakistan to do, quote, everything possible to prevent the conflict from reigniting. In the highly coded world of state media, everything possible translates to a genuine state of panic. He is desperate to preserve what he called the fragile but valuable momentum of the ceasefire.
Fragile but valuable. That really captures the razor's edge this whole situation is resting on. And, if you're wondering how backroom phone calls between Beijing and Islamabad actually impact your daily life, it all circles back to why this deal was written in the first place.
It circles back to the Strait of Hormuz. We live in an interconnected global economy that operates on a just-in-time delivery schedule. The stability of your grocery bill, the cost of your morning commute, the rate of inflation, it is all heavily tethered to the free flow of energy and goods through these massive global bottlenecks.
Yeah, we tend to think of global stability as this solid, permanent thing maintained by international law and public treaties. But what this deep dive exposes is that stability is often a temporary illusion, violently patched together in the dark.
Exactly.
The peace in a vital global region isn't being upheld by the leaders smiling for the cameras. It is being aggressively, frantically managed through electronic back channels by a third-party superpower that is simultaneously preparing to sell weapons to the very people it just pacified.
And when a single face-to-face meeting in Islamabad breaks down over an issue of trust, that invisible scaffolding buckles and the economic tremors are felt worldwide.
It is a phenomenal reframing of how modern history is actually written. I mean, we started with a triumphant press release praising Pakistan for an unprecedented diplomatic victory.
Right.
But by peeling back the layers of our sources, we uncovered a completely different reality. We found a Chinese-authored blueprint. We found a sovereign nation acting as a secure digital router to launder diplomatic liability.
Yeah.
We found a superpower securing its oil lanes while simultaneously tethering a volatile nation's military to its own defense industry to gain leverage in an entirely separate negotiation with the United States.
It really forces you to question the surface level of every geopolitical event you see, which leaves us with a genuinely unsettling question to consider long after you turn this off.
What's that?
If a historic peace agreement between two fierce global adversaries can be entirely ghost-written by a superpower, routed through a VPN nation, and driven by hidden economic motives without the public ever catching on, well, how many other global crises happening right now are being perfectly seared by invisible hands we aren't even looking for?
That is exactly what you should be asking the next time you see a historic handshake on your screen. Don't look at the people signing the paper. Look 50 feet out of frame, into the dark room, and ask yourself, who is really holding the pen? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive, and as always, keep looking past the headlines.